are. We are welcoming everybody to our first Fireside Chat of 2024. We're so glad to be here talking about popular culture, all things about heartbreak and what happens when people who inspire us and we love their artistry breaks our hearts by causing harm. So this evening, I am joined by two of our incredible leaders at Salal, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in just a moment. But first and foremost, we wanted to take a moment and acknowledge the lands that we are joining from. We are joining here from the ancestral and occupied lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And at Salal, we are always thinking about how the ongoing legacy of colonization intersects directly with the sexual violence that people experience on these lands, and also the binaries that we find ourselves in relation to gender and carcerality. And those are some of the things that we're going to explore tonight. So I will hand it over to you, Karen. You're right beside me. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Dalya. My name is Karen Alcantara. My pronouns are she, her. I come from the Dominican Republic, although my father's lands are from England and Scotland and Ireland. And yeah, I'm really excited to do this work. As always, I'm excited for this conversation. I hope I don't get too spicy. And I'm also currently on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I'll pass it over to you, Sil.
Hi, my name is Sil. Pronouns are she and her. I am the manager of operations at Salal, and I am originally from Guatemala, that is in Central America. Well, you know what? I have been in Canada for about 10 and a bit years. So they haven't kicked the spicy out of me yet. So probably we'll go in there. Completely. Very happy to be here. And I just want to acknowledge that I am taking this call from the ancestral, unceded, and stolen territories of the Katzie First Nations. And thank you for having me.
And I am Dalya. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining from Musqueam territory this evening and joining also as a first generation Canadian whose parents moved here without consent, and am constantly thinking about those parts of my identity as I have been here my whole life. So I grew up in Vancouver, which is very rare. I know Karen, you did as well. Um, and yeah, constantly thinking about what it means to grow up here, but also be raising kiddos here on these lands, and how we relate to one another. So I think I'm just going to bring heartbreak to this conversation. Because that seems to be the thing that I keep trying to figure out. So I think part of the reason we wanted to have this conversation is because, over the past decade or so, not that it wasn't existing before, but we've had this cultural tipping point around conversations related to sexual violence, and particularly more related to people who are music artists, who are actors, who are very much part of popular culture, who have been idols. And we've kind of seen how the public responds to the truths that get spoken. And it's not always very favorable for survivors of sexual violence. And I think one of the things that we've had conversations about at the organization is that survivors are always listening. They're always listening to people in their lives, how they're going to respond. They're listening to how the media will report on issues or episodes related to sexual violence. They're listening to their friends and families about whether they are safe people in their lives and whether they can disclose what's happened to them too. And also, who are the people that are safe enough to seek support from? And so kind of issues related to popular culture really do have such an impact on our work and also on our communities. because as I said, people are really watching and listening. So one of the themes that we kind of acknowledged as a team is that we don't seem to be super skilled up about the both and stuff. And if we are beginning to question as a society whether throwing people in jail and letting them rot there is going to actually change the behaviors that we don't want to see in humans, and we still need to have accountability mechanisms and deal with our own feelings of, you know, transgression and trust being broken, how do we hold that paradox? And what do we do when people who we love, whether they're in our families or whether they're in popular culture, when they do transgress us or people that we love? How do we make sense of that? And so we thought we'd have this conversation because there seems to be a lot going on in Hollywood, in the music industry, and they seem to be good case studies for us to be wrestling with these ideas. So I am going to participate in the conversation, but I'm also going to moderate a little bit. And so my first question to you both is, what has your relationship with popular culture been like over time? How important has it been for you? You know, do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you engage with it? What's it been like?
I think if I may go first, if it's okay. I think for me it has been, like a big onion that has different layers. And some of the layers that I have discovered, I'm like, nah. And some of the other layers are like, okay, I'm keeping this, I'm using this, and this is okay. One thing that I was never a fan of is getting too much involved in the history or the personal story of artists. I always thought that knowing that kind of messed up with my ideas or my imagination that I will get when I listen to a song, for example, or what this song meant to me. And then someone told me, oh, you know that this so and so wrote this song because of this, and I'm like, but you just ruined it for me. It will be like that, like it's a give and take, right, with that, because sometimes I would be interested, like, what kind of life did this person have, in order to write this song. And I'm going to give a very clear example of what I mean by this. There is a very famous writer called Violeta Parra. She's Latin American, and was Latin American, and she wrote this beautiful song that is it says thank you life, for everything that you have given me. And the song was made famous by another artist called Mercedes Sosa, who is amazing singer. If you ever look her up, she is amazing. This voice that is just great, right? And when I listened to that song, it's such a song, such a beautiful song about life, but there was an undertone that I always felt with that song of sadness. And turns out that the woman who wrote this song committed suicide a few years after writing this song. And that in that way, because I was very conflicted with what the song was saying and what it meant for me, I did look into the story of who wrote it, of who was the owner of this piece of art that meant so much, that moved me so much. So it depends. In some occasions, I'm rather not interested in knowing about, oh, so and so is dating this person now, and so is dating that person now. I'm more interested about, the context and the substance that art may have for people. So that has been my relationship throughout the years with pop culture. At some point, of course, there were, horrible, terrible songs that are called the guilty pleasures, like Backstreet Boys and things like that, and it's, yes, it's more of a memory of having fun as a young person, but yeah, that's pretty much my relationship with it. However, I'm just going to say this, that because I have worked in the anti-violence sector for such a long time, whenever someone famous was involved in a situation around sexual assault, it became something that did interest me to know, like, okay, what is happening around this? That then I will give attention, then I will care about this, because it was important to get myself involved into that, because of that narrative of I believe survivors, but if it's someone that I know, maybe not, or if it's someone that I like, maybe not, you know. And that is very common in Latin America. It's the way that sexual violence is treated. It's like, I will believe you, but oh, you know what, I know this person, is my colleague, is my friend, he would never. And yeah, he did. So it is, you know, around that. So that's me.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God, I'm like such a nerd, and so the opposite. I like researched the last when I don't even really like Beyonce. Oh my gosh, don't tell that to anybody unless it's Destiny's Child. But when Lemonade came out, I needed to find out who Becky with the good hair was. And I went down the rabbit hole and figured out the whole like plot list of it all. But I think like for whatever reason, like analyzing social situations is like the reason why when I like a sentence in a song is really important to me. I'm like, oh, I want to know the backstory. History and psychology are like my two loves. Um, but I think my relationship with pop culture, particularly for this conversation, is really fascinating because I grew up on like gangster rap music. Like even, you know, I had an older brother who was about 4 years older than me, and we like I was watching a video of our Christmas, and there's like the Biggie's new album is playing on Christmas morning while we're opening presents. Like rap music has been throughout my whole life. And as I started to do this work, um, I remember doing the volunteer training at Salal, and they were talking about media. How does media portray like rape culture? And I was like, oh no, I'm never gonna enjoy my gangster rap music anymore. Because it can be so, and don't get me wrong, rap music can be so empowering, it can be political, it can be beautiful, it can be all of those things, and it can also be inherently misogynistic, it can be inherently violent towards women. And there was a lot of songs that I listened to that have portray a lot of violence towards feminine folks. So as I have grown through different areas of my life, pop culture has really, my lens has changed, and my guilty pleasures are still unfortunately gangster rap music. But, um, you know, I try to make up for it in my other deeds. You know, at the end of the day, like, you can't fault DMX for writing a line when he didn't know any better back in the day, I guess. But yeah, it's very interesting now with the more information, the more education, the more I understand community, the more I understand systems. You see it in everything, right? And so it's like you can be, I really enjoy watching actually like culture critics talk about music from back in the day or now, because the understanding of like what this symbol actually means in a whole is really, really incredible to understand, because the music industry, as we all know, it has so much impact, right? And so there's many people making decisions behind the scenes, and it feels a lot more, I guess, like empowering to understand those messages. Like even the new like Doja Cat music video. No, I can't remember. It's not Doja Cat. I can't remember. Anyways, um, you can just tell the messages that they're trying to send now more and more. And I wouldn't have had that ability to have that education had I not, you know, started working in the anti-violence sector for sure.
Yeah. I also, am a big hip hop head and grew up in the 90s with very misogynistic music being the main soundtrack of my life. Um, and it's interesting to step back and think about, yeah, the music industry as a whole and just how um, insidious misogyny and also white supremacy is within those systems, because the reality is that the music that we consume, and perhaps less so now with Spotify and other kind of music streaming platforms where people can upload their own music, but realistically, up until a couple years ago, it required you convincing like an A&R rep to play your music. And they were, and by and large are the people that are deciding who gets listened to and what kinds of music is going to be allowed to be played out in the world, right? And so yeah, I think it's a really interesting popular culture for me as a sociology nerd, really just tells us like so much about the systems that are so present in our lives, you know. It's never the full truth of who we are. But it's also really interesting to kind of start to make sense of what we're seeing unfold, because a lot of the people who were the big artists in the 90s are now people who are producing and are responsible for putting music out. They are also people who have quote unquote mentored younger artists, have groomed younger artists, and we're starting to see folks speak out about their experiences of that. And I think part of the like broken system pieces is alongside of the misogyny um, has also been the homophobia and transphobia that has been so rife through the music industry. And yeah, I'm curious to hear from both of you about how you're making sense of what you're seeing unfold in popular culture, and whether that's, you know, Louis C.K. or Giangomeshi or Cosby or Epstein, Prince Edward, right? Like all of these massive figures who we're seeing just have truths told about them and the harm that they've caused. What are you both thinking about?
I might jump in. It's like, to me, it's the dismantling of the power system, though, right? Like, think about the names that you just described, like particularly Prince Edward, but even P Diddy, when that came out, I was like, duh. He just put out a documentary where he was walking around like an absolute egomaniac, and everybody watched it because it was all of the songs that we all listened to, and in some capacity, he was like trying to be a little bit better, but if we're thinking about, as you said, like from a sociology like understanding and thinking about all these systems, these are men with like an incredible amount of power that are able to do whatever they want. It's the same thing as like Weinstein, right? It was like everybody knew, even Brad Pitt knew when he was with Gwyneth Paltrow. What are you going to do about it? Nothing, because the power system holds them up, right? And I feel like now, like, I love Gen Zs. I don't know why boomers don't like the people underneath them. I love the new generations. They know so much cool shit. They're like, they call everything out. They're like, you're hurting my feelings. You're offending me. Like, and they're the accountability, the repair. I'm like, okay, I'm here for it. Like, they are P. Diddy, particularly. Sorry to keep harping on him. I just feel like the ways in which they exert their power is so insidious. I think that was the same with R. Kelly, too. And it's because the propelling of that power dynamic. And I feel like now that structure is finally going away, where there's so much more space and availability for people to just talk. I mean, I know it's not everywhere, and there's still lots of spaces where there's not safety, but the more we have these conversations and the less we're like saying that, you know, sexualized violence is happening in an alley. Somebody said that to me the other day. They're like, well, you know, like when you're walking down an alley, and I'm like, no, please tell me you don't still believe that. Like, that's not where sexual violence is happening. And the more we are talking about how it's in relationships, you know, when Cassie came out about R. Kelly, like that, I mean, P. Diddy, that was incredible. Imagine how long she'd been carrying that for, you know what I mean? And how everybody thought this or that, or, you know, when Amber Rose came out about Kanye West and said the same thing, and that he's controlling and freaky. No one believed him. And then he went crazy on Kim. And then apparently now it's all true, you know, like those structures and the availability for truth is such a beautiful way where we can support each other and say, like, hey, this happened, and hey, this happened to me, and hey, this happened to me. And yeah, I think it's just a really like clear description or clear representation of how power is a huge part, has like is the biggest part to play in sexualized violence.
I think, you know, about the power dynamic in the situations that you mentioned, especially with these people that were mentioned. And yes, how having that power, and I'm going to directly quote Notorious B.I.G., more money, more problems. And it is true. It's, it came like that. Having all that power and having also add another component that is very important. And Dalya, you and I, we grew up in the 90s. I'm a little bit, later 90s, but it's also the 90s. And I also grew up in a country where we are, behind in times when it comes about education around sexuality. And the thing is that these pieces around sexuality, consent, and how a sexual relationship needs to be consensual and needs to be harmonious. And yes, there might be different ways of expressing it, but you need to have consent from the other person in order, to engage in those things that you like. That lack of education as well, for me, is a key component, that adding up that power when you're growing up knowing nothing or knowing so little about your own sexuality, let alone the sexuality of a marginalized gender, it's going to be, like feeding that into that pole, like, oh, I have power. This is what I learned. What I learned is that power as a cisgender man gives me this. Oh boy, I also feel like I don't have enough power because of the color of my skin, because I'm a racialized individual. I have been marginalized, and this upsets me, and it's feeding there. So it's as if everything is just feeding that power trip, right? And just fitting in that one. And of course, that's going to happen. And it is very interesting how the first thing that I hear people say when say like, oh, did you hear that? Turns out P. Diddy rape this person. And people say, no, that, no. It's like, okay, yes, it happened. It did happen. So, but why isn't our response like, that's bad? Why is it no? That this belief, like, really, where have you been your whole life? Like, have you seen the world? Do you see how people have been brought up? Like, does it surprise you? Really? So that is, like at some point, I think like that. I think like with Louis C.K., for example, that I see that he is a father of two, I think he has two daughters. I think, might be more or less. Two daughters, I think, in my memory. And I think about when he was explaining himself, like acknowledging, yes, it was a bad thing. I didn't know that I was doing a bad thing. And I'm like, really? Like, you didn't know that you were doing a bad thing? Really? Like, what if someone does that in front of your two daughters? What would you think? That's what I think. It's like I go into those concepts of,
But I think that's just it, is that like I think that that's how rape culture has us all um within our own privileged spaces. We have blind spots, right? And I
yeah,
think that when we say like systems are working exactly the way that they're supposed to be, I think this is part of it, right? And I think for a society that has masculinity, like tagged as being cis, as being heterosexual, as owning the world, like it's it's so tied in with capitalism and colonialism and get as many, notches on your bedpost or your body count or whatever. Um, the like the inability to actually feel the impact that you have on other people. I think for that's the reality of toxic masculinity. And I don't like it's fascinating when I think about like R. Kelly as a survivor, or I think about like Little Wayne, like disclosing on live. It was like on Jay Leno or something. He like disclosed this whole thing about his babysitter, and it was like couched in this idea that he was like, so macho because he lost his virginity at 12 by his babysitter. And I'm like, okay, this person can't even conceptualize the fact that like he was a child, could not consent, and his babysitter had power over him. And our society didn't even like blink an eye at that, right? And so I think about how homophobia and just this idea of like what it means to be quote unquote a man in our society, like really we're all, we say this, it's so cliche, but like we're all losing, right? Particularly for men. And I think also the fact that women cause harm also, right? And have power in different situations. We don't want to or like to talk about that because the numbers are different. But the reality is that, any gender can embody power over and those toxic traits for sure. Um, yeah, I go ahead, Karen.
No, I wanted to just touch on that a little bit in the sense, and I think it ties back to this. It's like, but I think that comes back to the fact that we have an aversion to wanting to describe people that we love as monsters, right? So it's like we don't want to talk about the women who cause harm in society. We don't want to talk about the people that we love. We don't want to talk about the musicians. Like Sil said, it's that reaction, like no, or like, but he's such a good guy, and it's like, why is that first statement? And you know what I mean? I think it comes down to the fact that it's like we're all walking around in this idea. Like, remember back in the day where movies used to be like there was a bad guy and there was a good guy, and they were like black and white. It was like this person has all the good values and this person has all the bad values. And I remember when I watched the Michael Jackson documentary and everybody was going crazy like this, like this, like this. And I was like, bro, people are complex. People have been hurt. Life is traumatic. People make mistakes. People are bad and also good at the same time. And like, let's actually have a conversation about that, because there's no healing when you just dissolve people to say you're a bad person 25, like 100%, like I don't want to talk to you anymore and you're only a good person. Because what happens, that perfection isn't real. There's that comes in that capitalism, like we're all hustling for worthiness. Nobody can have a bad day or have a pimple or god forbid show up to a meeting and start bawling their eyes out. Like nobody is good or bad. And I think that in this conversation, but like in general, every time we have one of our heroes do something quote unquote bad, like all of a sudden it's like we don't know how to act. Like Martin Luther King, they're going to come out apparently with a bunch of tapes that he was having, I don't know what the freaking word is, he was cheating on his wife. Does that make Martin Luther King not the fucking G? Like, you know what I mean? That doesn't change the shit that he's done. But for some reason, like the FBI thought that was going to change the way the world thought of him. And it's because we actually can't have complicated conversations about people and have them be nuanced. Everybody has to be good or bad. And then when we do that, we leave out all of this beautiful parts of humanity and isolate people who've been hurt and people who are hurting.
I think to add to that point is that there's two things there that I see, and it's like, does this bad thing will undo the good things, or are we more than that? Are we more than our actions at some point, or are we different? Are we like an onion with different layers, and one layer might be rotten, and that's the layer that we decided not to throw away but keep and show to the world and we did harm? Or what is it? Like, if there are different aspects of an individual that can be seen and can be taken and kept. I tell you, I have seen it firsthand. People who are mentors, people who are allies, people who have contributed to social change, especially in my country. My country has a lot of complexities in society, and there have been, allies that have gone, beside us and to protest, to claim the bodies of women that have been murdered, and they have been there and they have had power. The owner of a newspaper, turns out he was raping younger journalists, you know just using his power and everything, but he was a feminist ally, and things like that happen. But this guy actually helped because it was the only news outlet that would allow women to really say what they wanted to say, right? And really supported that progressive thinking of not discriminating people based on their gender, and was also helping against gender-based violence. But then he was doing it as well. And that is the complexity of humanity. It's like, Why? It's like you were with vulnerable people, and you heard how we were hurting, and you heard what we needed, and you still did this, right? But it's like people are more, and people have different things. And I think that with that example of Martin Luther King, it's like, yes, and he also helped lift people who were being massacred on a daily basis, who were being brutalized on a daily basis, and still. But let me tell you something. Let me ask something. I just want to ask this because I'm curious. I have posted quotes across my life from many philosophers, Greek philosophers, and stuff like that. I just love old school stuff. But if you post today a Martin Luther King quote, and you something that drives you and gives you passion and gives you motivation and really has helped you to find the light in a very dark world, and you use this quote, and this quote becomes like your mantra, and then tomorrow you find out about harm that he did, how would you handle this? What would you need in order for you to process this? And would you let go of that quote that has been your mantra and help you? Or would you keep it and separate it from the harm? I'm curious about that.
I mean, I think for me, what I've sat with over the past 10 years or so is that it's not realistic in our world to say that there's just a few bad apples, right? I think that, um, as we've been saying, the systems are set up exactly the way that they're supposed to be working. And that means that people who have power, who are inspirational, who get the spotlight, um, who people will flock to energetically because they can feel the influence that they have, um, will always be at risk of transgressing boundaries. And um, that those people should do better. There's no question. Um, and I think that it's so individualistic for me. Like, I feel like if I'm super triggered by somebody, the harm that somebody's caused, then I can't listen to their music or I can't look at their quotes. I think the Dalai Lama for me, like, was the last situation where there was a child that was harmed um, by him, and it was super public. And for me, it was like there was testing of like community and waters, and I just have like a really hard time with that kind of stuff. But like we were saying, like Michael Jackson, I still listen to Michael Jackson, and I still listen to also the guilty pleasure rap gangster rap music that I listen to, Two Live Crew and AMG and all of the hardest stuff out there. So um in my brain, I like can do the mental gymnastics in certain ways, but then there's some things that like really for me it's just like too much, and I cannot. But I'm also like not under any kind of false pretense that these things are like one in a dozen or they happen just randomly. It's like I pretty much am at the point in my life where there's no such thing as a bad apple, right? There's behaviors that are awful, that cause a tremendous amount of interruptions in people's lives and need accountability. And my hope is that we can get to a place where people don't back themselves into a wall to just try to cover um, their own backs, and that they can actually show up to the people that they've caused harm to. That's my dream. But yeah, those paradoxes are oftentimes live in my like physical response to the harm that the person's caused.
I have to say maybe something similar. I mean, For me, one of the biggest ones, so like I had a fairly traumatic childhood, I suppose. And Harry Potter was actually how I got through it. Continue to this day. Like, I met Tom Felton, like Draco Malfoy, as like a grown adult woman, and was like, I watch Harry Potter every day to go to sleep. And like, that's not a fucking lie. I can't sleep very well. I'm afraid of the dark. There's like lots of different things going on. And I have to, when I'm dealing with a lot of stuff, I have to watch a Harry Potter movie in order to go to bed. Do I agree with any of the shit that J.K. Rowling said? Absolutely not. It was disgusting. It was heartbreaking. It was all the words. Like I was dumbfounded. I literally went to the cafe where she wrote Harry Potter because I was like, oh my God, and then realized that this person is not a type of person that I'd want to sit down and talk to at all. I can see the humanity in them, whatever, have grace for everybody. But there's just some things, particularly as Dalya said, when you have that type of platform where you need to do better. But I can't give Harry Potter up. It's part of my trauma loop. Like, I need it. If I'm going through something, I need it to go to sleep. I need it to calm me down. When people pass away, I need to watch that in order to just ground myself. I still learned new things about it. I don't know how because I've probably watched it 1,000 fucking times. Um, so it is really complicated, I think, when you think about like, yeah, like how do you hold this idol or whatever accountable for something, and then also understanding that it has like meaning, that quote that has kept you alive, that quote has kept you alive, that's part of their, that is the art they give to the world, I guess, in a sense. And I don't know. And similarly, I think to Dalya, like it really depends. Like Chris Brown, I'm like, goodbye. Michael Jackson, I can't do that yet. Like every person has like a little thing where you're like, I can maybe do it, but I think it's that impact. But for me, particularly with this like question, I think J.K. Rowling was the biggest one for me. And I've inquired in my community, and they're like, here's some ways that you can like still love Harry Potter and not give money to J.K. Rowling, and different pieces like that where you can still feel like you're advocating within the world. But yeah, that was definitely one that I had to wrestle with, be sad with, grieve, figure out.
Maybe the fact that you don't research the background still protects you from needing to figure that out when things go sideways.
That's what I was gonna say. You know that there are songs that I don't even know if they are R. Kelly's. Like
Yeah.
the only song that I know for sure that it's R. Kelly's is the one that he did with Lady Gaga. That it's all about she's saying do what you want with my body, which is like she is giving consent. Like and it's like that's the only song that I know that it's R. Kelly. That I don't remember. I don't even know who's singing sometimes. But I'm gonna tell you something. Not long ago, there was this news that came out about okay, I'm a big Pink Floyd fan. Pink Floyd has spoken to me in so many ways since my childhood. My dad was a rocker. He loved rock. My dad was my best friend and he showed me everything about music. So I love Pink Floyd. And Roger Waters was being accused of wearing a Nazi uniform in a concert. And I'm like, well, fuckers, did you even see the wall? Do you know what he's doing? Because the wall is about the harm that that war did to him as a child because his dad was fighting against Nazis. And he always says, I'm against every single type of racism. But when I saw the headline, and I'm like, what the hell did you do, you stupid boomer? Like, that was my first reaction. Like, what did you do? And I read and I'm like, no, it's part of the representation of the show about, the wall is about someone who becomes an oppressor based on his trauma, his childhood trauma and everything, and then he becomes the aggressor, right? So it's like it's part of the show, and I'm like, okay, well, people need to watch the wall first before they are, like opening their mouth. But and I was, but that was my reaction, was like, what the fuck did you do? Like I just got mad. And I do have something that I do want to share, as a racialized individual. Um, Morrissey, the Smiths, the lead singer of the Smiths. He is openly against immigration in the UK, and there's a lot of controversy around it. However, every time a song from the Smiths or Morrissey comes up, whatever it is that it says, it's like, yeah, I'm feeling like that. And I just love it. And I'm not gonna stop listening to the Smiths, even though I am an immigrant, you know, and I'm not gonna stop because it's like, yeah, well, you know what? There were more people involved in creating this song. So just might as well. You know what? It I don't know. I just decide like, yeah, I separate myself from that, from the people. I am not replicating, I am not guiding my life based on what they did or their decisions or their perspectives. And I separate my life. So yes, it does protect me a little bit, but then you know what? It doesn't protect me from when people engage in shaming me for choosing to hear something or say something that I didn't know. Okay. Like, oh, if I just go and grab something from someone and I say expelliarmus, and they go like, oh, you can't actually use Harry Potter stuff anymore. And I'm like, why? But not, well, that was many years ago, but why? And then they tell me, no, you should see what J.K. Rowling is saying. And I'm like, well, fucking asshole. Why are you saying that? And I'm like, well, so then no, I cannot play it like that anymore. No. And that's my point. It's like I don't go around shaming people for listening to Michael Jackson. It's like, fine, whatever. As long as you're not modeling your life after him.
Yeah. In our workshops around media that Karen was talking about, we often talk about like I think the experience of like participating in popular culture as like a recipient. And so like Karen was saying, people have offerings to the world and then we interpret them and bring them into our lives in one way. But there's also the way that society, and folks who are being raised up in popular culture who might not have access to these conversations that are just like eating it as truth, right? And so it's that really interesting third space where like you don't know, you might be listening to the same song or watching the same movie or reading the same book as somebody, and your experience is like through your own filter and what you're taking from it or interpreting it, but another person might be experiencing that in a totally different way. And um I think that's the fascinating thing about popular culture is it can be so healing, but it can also be so damaging. And when I think about like I used to call R. Kelly the biggest pimp of like my generation because he was literally grooming us through his music to like put up with other, like for hetero folks in my world, put up with other men's shit, right? And like through the lyrics of the songs, like literally teaching us and grooming us through those lyrics. But I also think about survivors who I've walked through like their assaults beside them, where men who have assaulted them have been taught through media that like when women smile at you or when they talk to you, that's basically consent and you've got a free ride to do whatever you want, right? And so I think it's so important for us to be having kind of all of these conversations and always, I'm thinking about some of our gaps in our teachings, and where we can start to fill those gaps. And so for our last 10 minutes together, I'm wondering if you want to just comment on, what are some of the gaps in our learnings and our teachings as humans right now in this world that feels like we are seeing the unraveling, right? We are seeing Gen Z speaking truth to power and not being afraid to speak the truth about the harm that they've experienced or what doesn't feel right or good. And we are being taught that it's not a group of bad apples, that this is likely happening kind of all around us. So how do we not abandon the survivors in ourselves or in our lives? How are we able to make sense of these things? What are some of the skills that you think that we need to start building on? Where do we need to grow?
Oh my gosh, I love this question. And so I've listened to this podcast while I was trying to apply for this job to be the manager of counseling like 5 times. It was a Kai Ching Tom, and I can't remember the facilitator of it, but basically they just keep repeating like radical grace, radical grace. What does radical grace feel like? And I feel like the gaps in humanity right now, as like the whole world is just shifting and all of the fucking goo and shadow is just coming out, is like, how do we have radical grace for everybody's humanity? Like, you want to talk about our idols causing us harm and letting us down and doing all these things. It's like, okay, how do we have grace for like how the hell did they get there, and how, and in that radical grace, how can we maybe potentially have conversations to have them hold them accountable? And holding somebody accountable, the word prior to accountable is to hold them in that, right? Like, I think that we forget that in healing, it's a conversation, and like, it's not about punitive. And, everybody's had a communication with somebody who's hurt them and it turned out to be okay. Sure, it hasn't, maybe the harm isn't as impactful, and I'm not to say that people who have had that need to do that right away or ever, but like, everyone has had a conversation where there has had been repair. And I think part of that comes from grace and curiosity. And I think that the more we're able to do that, especially right now, and be curious with each other, I think like, since the pandemic, and there's been all these different ideologies, and everybody's like, I'm a Republican, I'm conservative, I'm this, like, everything's so divided. Personally, in my own personal life, I've had a relationship that I've had for almost 20 years, and we don't see eye to eye anymore. And I'm like, I don't care. I'm going to love you till you die. I don't care what your views are. And that has been my biggest lesson in teaching of grace, is like, okay, if I love this person since I was 15 years old and they do not believe the same thing that I believe, I'm not letting this relationship go. I had to learn to ask questions. I had to learn to be curious. I had to learn to have grace for his humanity and mine. And I think that that's something that's been really helping me for the past year or so. And I think it also allows my humanness, my survivorness, another person's survivorness to be in the space as well.
Beautiful. That's so beautiful. I love that.
I actually got to send you that podcast by Kai Ching called Radical Grace. It has not left my mind, and I love it.
Yeah. I think that when I think about, what you were saying, Karen, about really trying to understand and trying, to accept, I think that's where the gap is. A lot of people repeat things that sound so great and want to model certain things that are beautiful, like spirituality. I was looking at this reel. I that's my thing. I fall asleep watching reels on Instagram. And I was watching this reel, and it's this two persons that are being all, like with boho dresses and the necklaces and everything, like being all spiritual, quotation marks. And they're saying about, yes, heal your body and heal your soul. And the other one goes like, start saying a lot of political things, like talking about wars that are going on and everything, but very, very sound, and not like just ignoring that war affects the everybody, right? And it's kind of, and the other one is like trying, no, that's not spiritual. You need to only say positive things. You cannot say negative things. You cannot say this. So I think that is where the gap is. That is like all these things that sounds very good, and oh, if I repeat them, then I have this, and if I do them, then I have analysis. If I just say what they are telling me to say, and I sound this way, then I will be believed to be this. Like, for example, how they ruin the term woke. Woke is a term that it's powerful, that means something, and it was stolen and made something that now people don't even know what it means. It's the same thing with sexualized violence. It's the same thing. And I think that's the gap. That is when we don't go deeper into understanding that it is not just one day, one decision, or one apple, or a few apples. It is something that has been taught and has been indoctrinated by the lack of education and the lack of support and the lack of grace that we give each other as human beings. That is what I think is the gap.
For me, it's the buy-in fully by dominant culture that there is a liminal amount of safety, of love, of character, of goodness. It's this like scarcity mindset that is so damn pervasive. I often joke around to people in my family about like compliments don't actually cost you anything. Like you you can offer love and care and witness people freely and it will not diminish your light. But I feel like we're so bound up in life um thinking that our behaviors are ourselves, that when we do cause harm or when we could have done better, or when there's another version of how we could have behaved that's offered to us, the doubling down to try to maintain the position um, creates that lockup, right? And I just think about like if we actually believed that there was infinite amounts of love, if there was infinite amounts of opportunity to change, um, if we're in community with each other and we don't have to do life on our own and capitalism wasn't so deeply embedded in our veins, um, that we could acknowledge that we are all fully human. And that means that we're going to inevitably cause harm. Um, and that those conversations of repair, those opportunities to move at the speed of trust are like the most deeply impactful and spiritual and life affirming opportunities possible. Um, and so, yeah, this is the conversation that I have with my kiddo all the time. It's like, we don't have to hold on to our love. We don't have to hold on to our compliments and our belief in each other because it'll make us all better um, if we believe that there's exponential amounts of those things available, including safety, right? Because so much also of how people become vulnerable to other people who have more power than them is because they're trying to achieve, a job, maintain a job, get the ability to be a star, whatever that looks like. Um, and it puts them in vulnerable positions because of what society is expecting. So, okay, we have 3 minutes left. I'm going to give each of you a chance to do your final thoughts, anything that's resonating, anything that you want to, any books or podcasts or I don't know, anything you want to share with folks who might watch this.
I would like to, I don't have any podcast or anything to share like that, but I would just like to say that what I want people to remember is first, have hope. Hope is important, and it's very linked to what you were saying, Dalia, that hope matters and redemption is possible. Human beings have the capacity to change and to evolve. And it is good to remember that redemption exists and hope exists and accountability exists and is important. That's what I want to say.
I'm gonna go with the classic Mama Karen. Drink water. It's good for you. Tell your friends. Check on yourself. Check on others. And whenever you feel frustrated, think about the word radical grace, what that means to you, with other people, with yourself. Carry that medicine forward. It has really been a huge, huge help for me this year.
Well, hopefully we've added a little bit of complexity to your thinking around what happens when people you love become an asshole. Um, and of course, let us know what you're thinking. We will certainly continue these conversations, and we're always super interested in what our community has to say. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again.